The man who murdered a 21-year-old girl on her birthday, in fact, by the way, at a birthday celebration he threw for her, has just been sentenced for this heinous crime. We're going to get into the details, the sentence, whether he could be released from prison, and the words of the killer himself. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. It was a somber day this week in a courtroom in Syracuse, New York, because that is where a man learned his sentence after strangling to death his childhood friend on her birthday back on June 18th, 2024. We're talking about 21-year-old Jhon Chacaguasay-Ilbis, who killed 21-year-old Joselyn Toaquiza and then dumped her body in a shallow grave under sticks and leaves in a park. So young, and when you look at those ages, and by the way, talking about the ages, Jhon killed her after inviting her to an Airbnb that he rented out for her birthday, her 21st birthday, namely to throw her a birthday party, a celebration. As reported by lawandcrime.com, there was a cake, new sneakers as a form of gifts, miniature wine bottles with the words "I love you" written on them, and apparently that park where he buried her was across from the Airbnb. Now, it's still not clear the reason, the motive laid out for why he did this, and that's one of the most chilling aspects of this story, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. But what we do know is that it was reported this pair were from Ecuador. They had known each other in school there. They had traveled to the United States the year before. Apparently, they were waiting on immigration hearings, and the status of their relationship was also not entirely known. But what I will tell you, what is clear, was the evidence against him, particularly a key piece of evidence. You see, because this is important. Here's the timeline. So Joselyn was working as a housekeeper at a central New York hotel called the Hotel Concord when Jhon met up with her to take her to that Airbnb. And this is important because based on home surveillance footage from the property owner of that Airbnb, you can see Jhon and Joselyn walk into that home at around 4:20 p.m. You see them on their phones, and then you actually see a clear shot of Jhon as he walks up the stairs. And then about 3 hours later, the video captures him exiting the house, carrying Joselyn on his back. She looks limp. She's not moving. Can't tell if she's alive or not, potentially unconscious. And he apparently goes back into the house after dumping her body and leaves wearing new clothes, and then hops on a bus to New York City. This is according to Syracuse.com. And according to People, it was revealed in court that while he was in New York City, he was using Joselyn's credit cards, making purchases, including an OnlyFans subscription. Also, according to Syracuse.com, the homeowner told police there was blood found in the house. Now, Joselyn's family reported her missing the next day when she didn't show up for work, and her body was found only a few days later. Before I get into more of this, I want to bring back onto the show trial attorney Bob Hille. Bob, it's good to see you. Thanks so much for taking the time. Appreciate it. What do you make of this crime, and what do you make of the evidence that the defendant left behind?
Well, Jesse, thanks for having me back again, and it's always great to be with you. This case really doesn't make sense. I mean, if somebody was plotting to murder this young woman, they wouldn't have been so stupid to leave so many clues. And just basically everything that you look about in this case, it seems to suggest that he was planning a romantic evening, not an evening that was going to end in a murder. So I think that may have been why the prosecutors looked at this case a little bit differently in terms of any or lack of premeditation.
Crazy story, really sad story. And look, it's an important one. It's an important one to bring to you. And for that, I have to call out and thank our sponsor, Sally, because their support helped make this episode happen. Now, Sally is an incredible eSIM service app. So I recently went on vacation to Italy, and Sally is something I could download on my phone because I use so much data while I was away. While everybody else is dealing with roaming fees and having issues with their cellular data, you can use Sally as a hotspot to easily plan your activities. And with the Sally app, getting an eSIM really couldn't be simpler because you just buy a plan on the Sally app, you activate it, and once you have it activated, you're good to go. You can use the internet wherever you go. Once the Sally eSIM is installed, there's no need to install a new one for each country. The same eSIM can use plans that are available in over 190 countries. So go to sally.com/sidebar, click the link in the description or pinned in the comments to get an exclusive 15% discount on Sally data plans, and be sure to use our promo code SIDEBAR at checkout. Well, it's different because in New York, an intentional killing is second-degree murder, and that's what he was ultimately faced with. But when you talk about strangulation, right, that's what they determined he did here. And by the way, he would later admit that he used a ligature to do that. That method of killing, what does that tell you about the theory of the case?
Two things. Number one, the ligature, a little degree of planning, which would suggest that there was a forethought, if not premeditation. The other part of it, with strangulation, there's an ability during that process to basically stop. And, by continuing until the person is dead, it shows an intent, obviously, there to kill that person. So the intent element, I think, is certainly established by the strangulation. But that, plus the way it happened, could suggest that, a higher level of charge was warranted here.
Well, it makes me also think how up close and personal that is. And sometimes I've seen cases before when you're dealing with strangulation, you will see a defendant try to say it was manslaughter or, the heat of the moment of something like that. And we don't really know what happened behind closed doors. And I wonder, would there have been an advantage? And we'll talk about the fact that he, his case didn't go to trial. Do you think there would have been an advantage to try to do that, to try to push forward, a heat of passion sort of argument?
Well, and it is an affirmative defense to a second-degree murder charge that it was the product not of an intent to kill, but of an extreme emotional response.
Like something happened.
Right, and that issue between them that triggered that event is always viewed from the defendant's perspective, but it has to be reasonable that someone in his situation could be seen as losing control.
I thought it was really interesting because it was reported that he actually turned himself into authorities in Spring Valley in Rockland County, which I believe is over 30 miles from New York City. And then during his arraignment, he claims he was too drunk to remember what happened. Odd, right? What does that tell you?
Well, obviously, as we know, getting drunk is a voluntary act, so it's not really a defense to anything. It may be defense to some aggravating factors or things like that. And maybe that's why, again, here the DA looked at it a little differently in terms of a second-degree murder case. But, maybe he had some thoughts that said, hey, look, I better watch out because if I don't give an excuse for what I did, I could be in some real trouble with the highest level of exposure here on a crime.
Back in January, Jhon Chacaguasay-Ilbis pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and concealment of a human corpse. His attorney indicated that he wanted to take responsibility for the crime. And in fact, during his sentencing, this is what he had to say.
Me disculpo con la familia de la Joana, con mi familia, amigos y compañeros.
I want to apologize to Joanna's family, to my family, and to my friends and mates
Todo el dolor y sufrimiento que he causado.
for all the pain and suffering that I have caused.
Me siento muy mal y avergonzado por esta situación,
I feel really bad and ashamed for this situation that I've caused,
por alterar mis principios y valores.
for ignoring my principles and values.
And then he went on to say, I understand and I respect your pain. I acknowledge the damages I made. I'm responsible for my actions. I regret everything, and I wholeheartedly ask for your forgiveness. I wasn't conscious of what I did. What does that mean?
I think he's trying to create an excuse that he didn't really mean to hurt her, at least in his mind, perhaps, and his way of expressing things. But I think at the sentencing now, he's already pled guilty to the crime. He already knows what he's facing in terms of the penalty, and he's asking really the court to give whatever leniency it can give to him in terms of imposing that length of sentence on him. So I think this is all geared towards that. Whether remorse was genuine or not is something that the court has to really look at.
I'll get to the sentence in a minute, but why plead guilty in a case like this? Is it just the evidence is so strong, there's no possible defense, there's nowhere to go with this?
Well, I don't know, really. I mean, it seemed very quick between when the murder happened, the killing happened, when he was arrested, and then when he pled guilty. And he would have had to give a factual basis to support that plea for the court to actually accept that plea. So he would have had to make sure he checked all the boxes on the elements of
What do you
second-degree
mean that?
murder.
Like he would have had to admit, I did this, it was intentional?
I killed her.
Yeah.
I meant to kill her. but I didn't do it with any premeditation. And that's where it gets a little dicey from a defendant giving a factual predicate to support a guilty plea acceptance by the court, because the court has to accept the guilty plea. If there's not a factual basis, or there seems to be a basis where the defendant, based on state of mind or something like that, might have a defense, then the courts usually, and really they're obligated to reject that plea and give the defendant an opportunity to go to trial. Now, sometimes they can come back and, after they speak with the lawyer, look at what the elements of the offense are, look at the evidence again, then they'll come back and they'll say, you know, they'll augment that or add to it. But now at a sentencing, that's already been done. The plea's been accepted. So now it's only with respect to within the confines of what you can be sentenced to. You know, is there something the court should take into account from your perspective in terms of mitigation or lowering what that term should be for you within, obviously, what this law provides?
And I want to talk about that. So the Judge Ted Limpert, indicated that, quote, "This crime is inexplicable, and neither family nor court is aware of reasons for why this happened, and the family is going to wrestle with it, and no one can understand it."
They can't understand it, nor can I, nor can the people of this community. Why you would take the life of such a young, beautiful woman.
And Joselyn's family provided letters to the court as well, her cousin indicating that the family would never forgive this defendant. Her father writing, quote, "I am devastated by your departure, my princess." And further comments from the family were, "How can you live bearing the thought of having taken the life of an innocent person?" Family also said, "How can you sleep at night knowing that you've caused so much pain and suffering?" And in the end, the judge sentenced Jhon Chacaguasay-Ilbis to 23 years to life in prison. Now, Bob, let's talk about this. So my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was not much more the judge could have gone. He could have given 25 years to life in prison. Why not go? I know it's 2 extra years, but why not go that way? Why not? Why 23? Is it the age? Is it the circumstances? What do you think? What do you think?
Well,
the fact he pled guilty?
Well, he had to, first of all, weigh the crime, what happened, and look at that crime, and what that crime warrants here. And then look at the family, whether that, you know, and this is just heartbreaking to hear the family, and understandably so, for this young woman whose life was taken. So the court's going to look at that, look at the impact she had to the family, the community, because those are aggravating factors where you would up the length of time from the minimum, I think here would be 15 years. And he got 23 out of what could have been 25 to life. So I think that's part of it. I think the other issue there, though, is the court's looking at whether there was remorse here. There was a lack of criminal history. And, you know, they can't explain, and the court couldn't explain, which is probably why it got the upper end, why he would do this when it seemed like this was going to be something that was going to be a happy evening, not a tragic one.
And I think it's also that he pled guilty, right? The idea of there should be an incentive to spare everybody the pain, the heartache of a trial, having the prosecution put in evidence. So the idea is you know, it's 23 instead of 25. The chances he actually makes parole in 23 years? What do you think?
Probably for something like this, and depending upon how much of a groundswell of support, I just don't necessarily see this in 23 years being something where you're going to have a whole community that's up in arms. You know, I think that the system will do its job in evaluating this person when the time for parole comes to decide whether, you know, he should be released and under what conditions. But again, that's a long way off. We don't know where the family will be by then. They're going to play a major role in determining whether or not he should be paroled. And if they're not really heavy advocates in that regard, then it's unlikely that, you know, there'll be a groundswell of support to keep him behind bars.
If he were to come out and give a full explanation of what happened between him and Joselyn, explains why he killed her, you know, give some sort of motive, reason, explanation. And look, if you take his word as true, and he's really drunk and doesn't remember what happened, that could be a difficulty. But if he does provide an explanation, could that help him in the long run?
Well, maybe, but it's not going to happen in the short term.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a long time before somebody who probably wasn't even involved with this case is going to look at it and make that decision. But you know, again, there's going to be a lot of variables on that. I don't hear that there's an appeal process underway with him. I think
well, not if he pled guilty, he relinquishes that right.
Well, you could still appeal the sentence.
Oh, interesting. Okay, because that's not negotiated. He knew what the range would be, but he could still object to it.
Right. Now, it doesn't sound like he's challenging that. I mean, he didn't challenge the charges, and I doubt he's going to challenge the sentence at this point, and especially since he's, what, 23 or something like that?
Do you think his age will help him in the long run when it comes up to parole? I mean, like he committed this crime when he was very young. I mean, but then again, think about it. He took the life of somebody who doesn't have a life anymore, right? She was in the prime of her life.
Generally, the way the system looks at it, I think, is they'll go back to this day and look at that. And then they'll compare it to what he's done behind bars.
Oh, I see.
And I think they'll look at, you know, is this person who's made every effort to rehabilitate himself and return to society the best that he can? I mean, remember, we have sentences for a reason. That society says, this is what we think the appropriate penalty is for someone who does this. When you serve your time, you've served your debt to society in that regard. Morally, you're never going to serve your debt to the family.
No, that's 100% true, right? They don't get her back, and this doesn't fill that hole that's in their lives. I did think this was interesting. I wanted to bring it up to you. So according to People, something, again, very interesting, this dichotomy here. So you had the prosecutor call Jhon a cold-blooded killer in court, but his attorney said that his client, before his arrest, was mugged and sexually assaulted by a sex worker, that this showed he wasn't a cold-blooded killer, that Joselyn's death negatively impacted him, that he was putting himself in dangerous, risky situations. I thought that that was a very interesting argument, that he's getting himself into trouble in New York to show that he really is remorseful, and then really her death really did have an impact on him. I thought that, but again, he used her credit cards to get an OnlyFans subscription.
Which goes back to the idea that he either wasn't a very smart criminal, or he never really, you know, something was wrong there upstairs when this happened, and there was no premeditation behind it. You know, I think, to your point on that too, you know, what happened to him happened after the crime. It doesn't really go to a history of abuse or something like that that might be a mitigating factor for how this person responds to other people anyway, or that he acts up under certain situations or under certain stress. It might have been an indicator, but to bring this up at sentencing rather than to address it before a plea and determining whether or not this case goes to trial, I think is sort of maybe a mitigating factor, but it's a post-crime suggestion to the court that maybe there's something deeper going on with this person where the court maybe should give him a little bit of a break.
By the way, I think one of the biggest things about this case is that video. That video was so chilling, it would have, I mean, I think it would have led directly to his conviction if it went in front of a jury. We've seen a lot of cases recently where surveillance footage, you know, put aside the cell phone data, but surveillance footage, that not only helps solve crimes, but I think in today's day and age, they're everywhere. Ring doorbell cameras, home security, cameras on street corners. It is, thankfully, hopefully, becoming a lot more difficult to commit a crime in an urban environment, maybe sometimes even a rural environment because of that digital evidence.
Well, it's certainly a lot more difficult to get away with it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
The question of whether or not,
yeah, you're right.
And again, taking that in mind, you would have expected more planning if his purpose that evening was to kill her.
Yeah.
I don't think the court felt that his purpose that evening was to kill her, but under the circumstances,
yeah,
he got a good deal, and he warranted the upper end of that sentence range.
I mean, he might be released one day, and that's a very interesting thought to think about what happened to Joselyn. In a GoFundMe that was set up to actually transport Joselyn's body back to her home country. It read, "She was a very sweet young lady with a bright smile and joyful personality. Joselyn was known for her kindness, warmth, and unyielding spirit. Her sudden and untimely death has left an irreplaceable void in our hearts." And I feel, Bob, that lack of answers, that is what might hurt the family most. The idea, obviously, of him being potentially released is quite problematic for them, but I also think the lack of an explanation is a problem.
And I think in this case, he's not a threat to the family anymore 25 years from now.
Yeah.
But I think as we talked about the moral debt versus the societal debt, you know, nothing is going to bring her back, and nothing is going to ease that pain that those parents are going to have to live with every day. While his sentence may come to an end, theirs won't.
That's a good point. Bob Hille, good seeing you. Thanks so
Great
much for
seeing
taking
you
the
as
time.
always.
Appreciate it. All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.